What's up, everybody? It's your boy Monte. Welcome to poker vlog number 50, the big 50. This is now our second edited session from our video editor, playing our weekly game over at Outlaws. Pretty solid session overall. And for those of you stopping by for the first time, quick introduction. As I mentioned, my name is Monte. We are an aspiring poker player, currently playing one session a week, a 1-3 match to stat game at our local casino, trying to bump that up to at least twice a week for this upcoming 2025 year. I am by no means a professional. Poker is just a hobby I started 2.5 years ago. Absolutely love the game. Been trying to learn as much as I possibly can in regards to poker, turn it into a full-time thing. And this YouTube channel is me documenting the process of me hopefully going from a part-time player with a full-time job to maybe a poker professional. Who knows? Sky's the limit. So feel free to come along for the journey. That being said, let's jump into the poker. Ladies and gentlemen, for this hand, we looked down a queen jack offsuit. There was an open to $20 from the middle position player, 2 callers behind him. When the action got to me, I'm in the cutoff and I decided to come along for the 20 as well. The small blind and the big blind also put in the call. There is some money on the button, but that is not a straddle. We are playing the small blind game. If you guys haven't played that, basically all that happens is every single person on the button puts $5 every time it is their turn to be on the button, and only the person that is on the small blind can win this money, which obviously isn't going to happen every hand. So essentially, as this game goes in orbit, more and more money gets piled onto the button, which incentivizes the small blind to try and win the pot, which just goes and creates action for us. Either way, that's neither here nor there. 6 of us going to this board run out with 120 in the middle, and the board comes out 7 queen 10 with 2 hearts. We have top pair with a backdoor flush draw. The action checks over to me and I decide to fire here for $60, which is about half the pot. Small blind folds, and then the big blind decides to jam for well over 300 here, almost a full 2x over pot. The action folds over to me, and honestly, I cannot continue with this hand here. I think it over for a little bit because our opponent is pretty aggressive and could be just doing this with a flush draw. But if he doesn't have a flush draw, at the bare minimum, he's going to show me ace queen or a set. And the fact that we're holding the queen of hearts reduces the amount of combos of flush draws that he could have here. So all in all, I was not feeling great about making this call here. Didn't really have that much invested into the pot anyhow. So ultimately, I do decide on just folding here. I know this seems like a standard fold for those of you watching at home, but given the player and the history we have, this was a bit tough at the time. Moving on. If queen jack offsuit wasn't bad enough, for this next hand, we're playing 6-5 offsuit. The hijack opens to 20. The button puts in the call. The small blind puts in the call. And since we're already in for $3 and we are closing the action, I decided to get a bit out of line here and put in the call with 6-5 suited. Shouldn't have had the $3 in there to begin with, but I really like 6-5 for some reason. Obviously prefer it suited and in position, but whatever, we're here now. Going to this flop, which comes 7-5-7. The small blind checks and I decide to fire here for $25. The original pre-flop raiser very quickly puts in the call, 130 in the middle, and the 9 of spades peels off on the turn. I'm now going to size up here and I decide to go with a bet sizing of $100. At this point, alarm bells are going off in my head. I do not think our opponent is floating us for this bet sizing with ace high. Given the pre-flop action, I also don't expect him to have a 7 here a lot of the time. Really feels like an overpair. So at this point, I think our only option of winning this hand is going really big on the river, trying to represent a 7 ourselves. Keeping that in mind, we go to the river, which is a 2 of hearts with 330 in the middle. I decide to fire out for $250 here. Our opponent did not seem too thrilled about this bet sizing here on the river. He went into the blender for about 2 minutes and it really seemed like he was going back and forth between making the call and just folding his hand, but ultimately he decided that he liked his hand too much and did throw in a calling chip. We flip over our pair of 5s and our opponent flips over pocket queens. We had a right read on the situation and almost got him to lay it down. Fortunately, Jordan's too good and he sniffed us out this time. Well played, sir. The last hand was a bit of a disaster, but then we wake up with pocket 8s under the gun. I decide to make $30 to hopefully only get 1 or 2 callers, but we got 3 callers, 125 in the middle, and we go to this board run out, which comes 6 ace 5. Ace high board is definitely better for us than it is the other opponents. Decided to continue here for $65 and somehow it got through, recovering a little bit from that last hand. For this next hand, we look down at 4 deuce suited. Under the gun raises to $20. We get a caller in between, so we're obviously going to put the call in here with suited 1 gappers on the button. 4 players to the flop, $80 in the middle, and the board comes out 7 deuce 9 with 2 spades. The action checks over to us. All we have here is a pair of deuces, so I don't want to take the betting lead here, so I just go ahead and check this through. The turn comes a 4 of spades, which is a bit concerning, but after the action checks over to us, I can't imagine that any of these players have a flush here in this spot. I think somebody with 3 opponents involved in the hand would have bet a flush draw on the flop, or at least bet it on the turn once they got there. I can't imagine they would risk the action getting checked through by checking it through a second time. So for those reasons, I do decide to bet here for $40 with the intentions of continuing to bet on any non-spade rivers. We get 2 callers. There's now $200 in the middle as we go to this 5 of clubs on the river. The action checks over to us one more time, and it's time to go for some value here. Now, I don't think either of our opponents are that strong. I think they might just have a 9 or potentially even a 7 here. So I'm going to keep our bet sizing relatively small, trying to get called by just a single pair. I decide that 80 is the right number. Under the gun calls, but the cutoff folds. I show our 2 pair and our opponent flips over pocket 9s. What? This was the last hand I was expecting to see here. Our opponent played this very timidly, so I was not expecting him to have a hand as strong as 9s. I think he was slow playing it on the flop and then got scared when they flush got there on the turn and just went into check call mode. I was very wrong with my read on this one, but luckily it saved us some money this time. Unfortunately, it wasn't enough though, because our stack was looking a little defeated, so we added on for another $600. Not sure what was up with me tonight. We were playing super loose. I looked down at A6 offsuit in the low jack and decide it's good enough to limp. The hijack raises to 20, cutoff calls the 20, button calls the 20, and the big blind calls the 20. So when the action gets back to me, I put in the call as well. 103 in the middle, and the board runs out 879. The action checks over to the cutoff, who decides to bet $100. The button quickly folds. The big blind puts in the call. When the action gets back to me, I think it over for quite a bit here. It's very possible that somebody already has a made straight with Jack 10, but I don't think they'd go for a full pot size bet on this flop with Jack 10. Given the pre-flop action, I don't think it's an over pair like Jacks, Queens, Kings, or Aces. Could be pocket 10s, but I think it's a lot more likely that the cutoff is holding a set here. And since there is a flush and a straight draw out on the board, he's trying to protect his hand from both of those draws. The big blind tanked for quite a while before putting in the call, so I think he's also on some sort of draw. At the time, I put him on a flush draw, even though I am holding a spade, but I guess it's also possible that he was holding a 10 and was drawing to a different open ender. Anyhow, I end up putting in the call, and the hijack gets out of the way. $403 in the middle, and we go to this turn, which comes a 3 of heart. Big blind checks, I check, and then the cutoff decides to go all in for $200 even. The big blind thinks it over for quite some time. Doesn't seem to be a fan of the spot that he's in, but eventually he does slide the chips in the middle, and we're far too invested at this point to throw our hand away now, so I called the additional $200. So we're going to this river 3 ways, 937 in the middle, and the 9 of clubs is unfortunately not a card that we needed. The cutoff, Mr. Mike, ends up showing pocket kings. Wasn't expecting that, to be honest. The other Mike on the big blind throws his hand into the muck, and we let it go as well. Nice pot, Mikey. Before this hand got started, we did add on an additional $900 here. Unfortunately, I somehow misplaced the footage for that, so just take my word for it with the 2 stacks of green there. Moving on. For this next hand, we look down at 2 black 6s in the low jack. There is a $7 button straddle that we called. The action gets back over to the big blind, and he decides to bump it up for 15. We're definitely not going anywhere for $15. The hijack also calls, and the button calls, and the small blind calls. So we're going 5 ways to this flop with $105 in the middle, and the board runs out absolutely phenomenal. Queen 6 7. We flop bottom set. The action checks over to us, and I put in a small bet of $15. We very quickly get raised to 40. The button folds, small blind folds, and then the big blind folds. The action gets back over to me. I contemplate raising, but this board seems a little too dry for us to put in a raise. Our opponent at best just has a queen here. I doubt he has 2 pair with queen 7 or queen 6, and unless he has exactly ace queen, I highly doubt he's going to call a back raise. raise. So for those reasons, I decided to just call the 40 and see one more card here. 185 in the middle, and the turn comes a 10 of clubs. I check it over to the hijack, and he decides to continue here for $100. I very quickly put in the call. Once again, don't think there's too much going on this board. Don't want to scare him off. 385 in the middle, and the 4 of clubs peels off on the river. Now, I do want to mention that an open ender got there on the turn with 8-9, but I did not put our opponent on that hand, considering he re-raised us on the flop. Definitely put him on some sort of queen X hand. And if our opponent is holding a queen, it's impossible for him to have a flush here because the queen of clubs is on the board. So there's no way our opponent backed into a flush, and I'm not putting him on a straight. That being said, I'm not sure if our opponent is going to be afraid of either one of those two hands. So I don't want to check this in case our opponent just checks back, but I don't want to go. So we're going to bet here, but I don't want to go too big either. So I decide to make a bet of $200 on the river here, hoping that our opponent has a good kicker with his queen and puts the money in for this amount. Thinks it over for quite some time and eventually does make the call. We show our set of sixes, and our opponent shows queen 10 for a turn 2 pair. Probably could have gone a bit bigger on that river, but we won the pot, so screw it, let's not complain. For this next hand, we pick up 2 aces. The action folds over to the low jack, who makes a 20 to go. Hijack calls. I decide to bump it up to 40 to incentivize the players behind us to get out of the way, but keep the 2 people that are already involved in. That's exactly what happened. So we go 3 ways to this flop with 124 in the middle, and the board runs out 7 jack 8 rainbow. The low jack bets 25, and the hijack quickly folds. When the action gets back to me, I am not going to just flat the 25 here. He's either betting this and just taking a stab with absolutely nothing, or he's going for value with a jack. So I'm going to go ahead and put in a raise here. I decide to make it $75 to go. Our opponent puts in the call pretty quickly, so we go to this turn with 274 in the middle, and it comes a 2 of spades. Doesn't really change too much on this board. The action checks over to me, and at this point we can either go with a small bet sizing or a big bet sizing. Considering who is involved in the hand, this player really does not like to fold, and since he already called one big bet on the flop, I'm thinking he might call another big bet on the turn, so I decide to continue here for $200. Our opponent huffs and puffs and tanks for quite a long time here, mentioning things like we're trying to push him out of the hand and we really just want to end it there. Unsure if we have a set or some sort of random hand that's just trying to push him out of this pot, trying to represent a monster. He goes back and forth between calling and folding for a while and lines up his chips a couple of times, but ultimately he does end up folding queen jack offsuit face up and asks us if he was good, to which we quickly respond, "You'll see it on the vlog." But it was a good fold this time around, Mr. Seabass. Good job getting away from it. This week's guest hand is absolutely ludicrous. There was a good amount of pre-flop action with some raise and re-raises, and then our buddy Mike on the button decided to jam for 130 and some change. After that, because it was a legal raise, we had 3 different players go all in for all sorts of different stack sizes, so the dealer had to spend a good amount of time calculating all the different side pots, but eventually we got all the side pots figured out. Calculating all these things ourselves was just going to be way too chaotic and too much work, so just keep in mind that there's like $1 bajillion in this pot. And let's go ahead and roll the clip. Oh, and we are sweating Mike's hand for this one.
We're gonna put you as the hero hand, the big one.
I need to see these 2 hands for this pot. Pair 6. Hold on. There's 120, 130, 130. That's 6s, kings.
Woo, the 8-9, scoops the main. Absolutely crazy hand. Cannot believe 8-9 scooped there. Fortunately for the other players, he didn't have that much behind. Good job, Mr. Mike. Hold on to your seats, ladies and gentlemen, because we're holding two ladies in our hands and it's about to get crazy. There's an open to 20 by the middle position players. I call for 40 in the low jack. Mike in the big blind also calls the 40, so we're going three ways to this flop, 120 in the middle. Board comes out 5-7-5, relatively safe for our pocket queens. Considering the player behind us raised and then Mike called a 3-bet behind us, I don't expect either of them to have a 5 in their hand unless it's specifically ace-5 suited. So I think it makes more sense to check here and just hope that an ace or a king doesn't come on the turn. Luckily, the 3 of hearts is not a scare card for us. The action checks over to me and I'm going to put in a small bet here to go for some value of $50. Mike calls on the big blind and the middle position player folds. There's now 220 in the middle. The 7 of clubs doesn't change anything on this river. Mike checks it over to us and now we have a decision to make. Since the board currently contains 2 pairs, the 5s and the 7s, any ace is now a chop. I don't think our opponent has a pocket pair or we would have heard from them by now. So I want to pick a sizing that looks like we're trying to get our opponent off of the hand, but not too large that they won't call with ace high. So I decide to go with the bet sizing of 125. Our opponent thinks it over for a second, but does ultimately put in the call with ace king. We show our queens and they are good. For this next one, we look down at jack 10 suited in the small blind. There's a $12 open under the gun. The action folds over to the button who decides to make 35. And with suited connectors out of position, I typically don't like to call this big of a bet sizing pre-flop, but as you guys can see, there's a good amount of money saved up on that button. And all that means is I am the only player that can currently win that. Therefore, that amount of money is automatically added to the pot just for me. So keeping that in mind, along with the fact that our opponent has about 1100 behind and we have him covered, I do think a call makes sense here. So we go ahead and call the 35. Big blind folds, but then the under the gun player puts in the call. So we're going three ways to this flop with 110 in the middle. The board comes out queen, jack 5 rainbow. I very quickly put in a bet of $45 here, trying to represent the queen. If either one of our opponents caught a piece of this board or have a hand like ace king or ace 10, I don't expect them to fold to this bet sizing, but I do expect them to fold to continued aggression on the turn. But the button puts in the call for 45. We go to this turn heads up with $200 in the middle and we get a clean turn card, the 6 of hearts. And at this point, it's time for us to size up quite a bit. I want to go with somewhere between a 3/4 pot to a full pot size bet. So anything between 150 to 200, but instead I decide to fire 70 here. Not really sure what I was thinking, to be 100% honest. I may have been afraid that our opponent had the queen, but I should have bet a lot bigger to find out for sure whether or not he had the queen. That way I could just check fold the river. Problem with this bet sizing is a lot of draws. A hand like king 10 or 9-10 are going to call here. Even ace king might float another street for this price, so it doesn't really accomplish much. Anyhow, our opponent obviously put in the call. 340 in the middle as we go to this river, which is a 4 of spades. I wave the white flag. Our opponent checks it right back, and we have the exact same hand. Chop it up, dealer. At this point in the session, we've reduced the deficit that we were stuck by quite a bit. We're getting very close to even. We look down at pocket kings in the hijack and decide to get tricky here and limp in for $3. The button decides to raise to 20 and the small blind ends up calling the 20. We bump it up to 65 and it folds around to the small blind who ends up putting in the call. 156 in the middle and we go to this run out heads up, which comes 9, 10, 7. Small blind very quickly jams for 265 effective. We put in the call and go to this turn, which is an 8 of clubs, which I don't really like to see. And then the 6 of hearts on the river may have killed or saved us. We flip over our pocket kings and our opponent very slowly turns over 10-5 suited. So that river did in fact kill us, but a chop is better than a loss, I guess. Also disregard the plus 346 because we didn't make that much money in this hand. All right, ladies and gentlemen, buckle in because this hand is a bit unhinged. There's a $20 open from the under the gun player. The action folds to me. I look down at A7 suited on the button. So obviously we're putting in the call. Small blind folds and the big blind calls. Ignore the money on the button. That is the small blind game that we're paying. $61 in the middle and we go to this flop, which comes deuce 5-5 rainbow. Under the gun bets $30, which is about half the pot. He could be doing this with the right range of hands, 2 suited Broadway cards, any pocket pair above a 5, or potentially just ace high. And if he has ace high, he has us in pretty rough shape because he most certainly has a better kicker. Either way, I think floating for one street with our hand is okay, so I go ahead and put in the call for $30. The big blind decides to get out of the way, so we go heads up to this turn with 121 in the middle, which gives us top pair with the ace of hearts. Our opponent does not slow down and he bets $60. Yet another half pot sized bet. Like I mentioned before, it's possible that he was firing the flop with an ace high, so we're either really ahead or really behind here. I contemplate raising or just flatting, but ultimately do decide to just flat and see what sort of sizing he takes on the river. 241 in the middle and the 6 of spades peels off. Our opponent fires for 150 on this river here. Doesn't really change too much in my opinion. I still think our opponent has the same hands that we thought of before, either just 2 suited Broadway cards, bigger ace that we're losing to, or a pocket pair like 8s, 9s, or 10s. We're beating a lot of those hands and only losing to a small handful of them, so I ultimately do put in the call. Our opponent shows pocket 4s and our ace 7 is good. 281 bones coming our way. For this next hand, we get a bit out of line. As you can clearly see, we are in the small blind with ace 9 offsuit, but there's about $45 sitting on the button for the small blind game. The action folds to the button who makes it $12 to go. I decided to bump it up to 40, just trying to scoop the dead money now. Fortunately, we get called by the big blind and the button. We go to this flop, which comes deuce 3 jack with 2 clubs. I put in a check to see where we're at, and the action checks around, so I don't think anybody hit this board at all. So when the jack of clubs hits the turn, I don't expect it to change anybody's hand strength. I decide to fire $75 here, and the bluff gets through. So not only do we scoop the $83 in the middle, we're getting the additional 45 from the button and representing with our favorite dealer. For this next hand, we look down at pocket aces in the cutoff. The middle position player limps and then the action folds over to us. I bump it up to $20, not trying to scare anybody away. The button and the small blind get out of the way. The big blind puts in the call, and then the middle position player also puts in the call. So the graphics are off by $20 for this one, $61 in the middle as we go to this flop, which comes king 8-5 with 2 diamonds. Pretty good flop for us. Middle position player bets $20 here and 261, and this is where I think I perform an absolute blunder. I should absolutely be raising in my opinion in this spot, and I thought for sure I would have been raising when I watched the footage back, but that is not what we do. We put in a flat call instead for some reason. I think this is pretty stupid because if our opponent has a king or a flush draw, he's not going to fold to a small raise. Anyhow, $40 in the middle, and we go to this turn, which comes a 4 of diamonds, and now our opponent bets 75. We still have an overpair to the board with the ace of diamonds in our hand, so even if we're losing to a flush, we could still be drawing to the nuts here. This is where I think I make my second blunder. I definitely wanted to raise, and I did put in a raise, but we raised to 225. The issue I have with this bet sizing is we're only going to get called by better. I don't think our opponent is going to call this bet sizing with just a king. He does end up folding, and I kick myself for how I played this one. I think I left a lot of money on the table, but you live and you learn. Not sure if you guys noticed the sequence in the last 2 clips. For one of them, my chips were stacked tall because I was taking a picture for my thumbnail, and in the pocket aces hand, I actually had my green chips in a rack because I was racking up to get up when we got dealt aces. And then we looked down at another premium, which I'll show you in just a second, but this is absolutely atrocious. My chips are already in the rack. It's already 30 minutes past the time that I normally leave at, and I really just want to go. We were in for 2,400 tonight, which is the most we've been in a while, and I'm really not trying to get stacked right before we leave for the night. Bad news bears are all over us right now with our chips in the rack. Anyhow, we did look down at pocket 10s. There was a $20 open behind us, so I bump it up to 50. The button calls the 50, the small blind calls the 50, then the hijack puts in the additional 30. 203 going to this board run out 3 ways, and the board comes king 6-8 rainbow. The action checks over to me, and I decide to continue here with a $100 C bet. The small blind tanked for 2 to 3 minutes, but ultimately did end up mucking his hand, and when the action got back over to the low jack, he did decide to put in the call. 403 in the middle, and we go to this turn, which comes a queen of diamonds. Our opponent checks over to us, and we very quickly fire for 325. Our opponent called our $100 bet on the flop, so I'm assuming that he had a king. So I'm trying to make a very large bet sizing here, trying to represent either ace king or king queen. And at this point, our opponent goes into the blender for an extremely long time. It really seems like he has at least top pair here. I am sweating bullets over here as I wait for our opponent to make a decision, and he finally returns his cards to the dealer face down. We get away with a big old bluff, leave a nice $10 tip for our boy, and we get the F out of here. Going over these session stats, we ended up buying in for a total of 2,400, ended up cashing out 2,350 after paying out some tips to the dealers and the cage, and obviously food and those tips as well. Not bad considering how bad we were stuck at the start of the session and how wild we were playing. You're not going to win every single session, but when you minimize the losses, it really goes a long way. Well, that's it for this video, ladies and gentlemen. If you're watching this Thursday morning and are on the Central Coast, feel free to come down to Outlaws today at 5 p.m. for our weekly game. As you can see, there's no shortage of action or fun on Thursday nights. Good luck on the felt, everybody.